This is Jim Janossy, and this is the lecture for Chapter 11 of the Gombrich textbook, The Story of Art. In this chapter, we'll be taking a look at Europe in the 1300s, that is the 14th century, this decorated style, late Gothic, and also the international style which arose out of the Gothic. Let's take a look at what's going on in Europe at this time in the late 1300s, the end of the Crusades. Actually, the Crusades went on just a bit longer, the end of cathedral building also. Statuary again being used in churches. This decorated style we'll take a quick look at, kind of an overdone Gothic. And a new architecture in Florence where secular buildings are being given this Gothic treatment, whereas previously it was primarily for churches. And new techniques being evolved in realism with the rationalization that realism in church art is actually desirable. This goes against the concept that was popularized by Pope Gregory that decoration in churches should be only as artistic as sufficient to tell a religious story. Now we're going to see that there's a rationalization for realism that goes far beyond that. And we're going to take a look at detail and a lot of different types of perspective. So first of all, here's an example in this late Gothic era of a decorated cathedral. And you can see why, in fact, it's called this. Not only is this rose window round with a pointed arch, a Gothic arch supporting it, but notice all this very fine little tracery here and this kind of a flowing pattern to it. Notice also all of this decoration on the walls. These wall-to-wall statues here. Not just sufficient to be around the door, but the entire wall covered with it. And it looks like even more alcoves here for additional statues that were never placed. So at this point, the Gothic style is kind of running out of gas. It's getting to be as fancy as it possibly can be. It's not got much mileage left in it. And of course these towers becoming ever more ornate with all sorts of little intricate designs associated with them on these spires. This is an example, the Doge's Palace in Venice, of a secular building. This was not a church, but it began to be decorated in much the same way. So architects were branching out from simply doing church architecture. Notice here these little windows, quatrefoil windows, quattro meaning four segments in little circles. The same as down here, quatrefoil decoration. These are actually Greek columns. And these pointed arches, very Gothic, as well as this roof decoration in this way, and even statues being placed up here. So the decoration of the building, the architecture of it, although it was a building for a secular purpose, a non-church purpose, architects were addressing it with the same kind of style that had previously been used only in churches. Now here's an example of some very interesting art, a small statue of the Virgin Mary and Jesus. This is not rigid at all like we saw in the earlier Middle Ages. Notice that the drapery and here the folds of it, very exquisitely done. Very much in keeping with the resumption of the kinds of concepts of the hint of the body under the folds of the cloth that was evident in Greek statuary of 1500 years earlier. And the way the cloth is draped here, very, very elegant. Notice the informality of it too. Here's Jesus, not looking like a little adult in a kind of a rigid pose, but what he's doing is he's reaching up like a baby would reach up and touching his mother's face. Take a look also at the pose of the statue here, this curve, kind of an S-shaped curve like this. That's very much in keeping with the way a woman would actually stand to balance her infant on her hip. But it's a pose that's much less formal than the kind of rigid poses we've seen in the past. So, if you will, things are loosening up. Things are getting to be more realistic and less art simply for the purpose of being simple to tell a story or remind you of somebody. Now here, a Psalter page, something used in a church service, from the same era, even though we see here still this rigid kind of pattern book way of drawing people. These faces are all the same. The gesture here of surprise, hand up to the face. What's happening here is Jesus, this little infant that looks like an adult, sitting on this rather precariously balanced pedestal here, is lecturing his elders on points of theology. And his parents are in the background here, same faces here too. Parents are in the background here, as astonished as anybody else. This, because it was done for a religious purpose, followed the pattern that was established for this sort of presentation of the subject. But look down here. The page is also decorated with a much less formal, much less rigid type of a scene of an ordinary scene of everyday life. Looks like somebody going hunting here and perhaps a bird downing some other kind of a bird here. Somebody else running perhaps to get the prey that's fallen. On the very same page, a scene from ordinary life, kind of livening things up. So we do know the artist could do this, that they could draw things in a much more realistic way, a much less formal way. But here they were still following the formula because in this type of subject matter, the formula was necessary. It was expected. And this is just a bigger picture of that informal scene towards the bottom of the page. Now here is an example, one of two examples I'm going to show you, of a religious scene into which realism is creeping, as well as a lot of detail. Even though it's done with egg tempera, which is a difficult medium to work with, you're experimenting just a little bit with that and seeing how awkward it is to work with this. It dries very quickly and it's hard to get a consistent color across the background. What we have here is the Annunciation. The angel has come to tell Mary that she's going to be the mother of Jesus. Kind of a medieval tactic here actually is to spread the words out. He's speaking these words which are said in Latin, reaching her ear. Now, of course, she's a bit surprised by this. It looks like she's kind of put off by this. But what's happening here, aside from the symbolism that was kind of expected, the dove descending on the scene, that's the Holy Spirit coming down. The pictures up here of the patriarchs or other church figures looking on, the framing in kind of a symmetrical way of this feature, the angel's wings here, Mary being pretty much framed by this other arch, and this prominent arch here framing this visual element, the dove. So there's a degree of symmetry that still had to be abided by here, but take a look at a few other things too. This vase is actually being drawn with enough positional perspective here to really give us the idea that this is a space. It's not just flat, and this vase is standing out from the wall. And also here, a very small detail, but take a look at the book. The book is light here at the beginning where more light is falling on it, and it's going to a gray shade here because it's more in shadow. That's also a type of chiaroscuro effect. It's light perspective, and the artist is picking up on that, as well as what was already commonly done, this curvature of the face being shown by the same type of shading, this gradient kind of a shading here. One other thing to notice about this is the extreme amount of detail. Detail was being picked up on. It's really a piece of perspective called focus perspective. Focus perspective dictates that things close to you will be more detailed than things in the background. But we don't have much background here. It's a rather shallow scene. So in this case, the extreme amount of focus is intending to add realism to the scene. And you see the same thing here in these bird feathers that are kind of being made into the angel's wings, this kind of coloration in them. Difficult medium to work with, but the whole effect is one of reverence for the subject matter, but realism kind of inserting itself and breaking in subtle or perhaps hesitant ways. Now here we have another illustration of realism creeping into artistic creations. This is a stone carving on a church. It's what we think one of the first examples of a face not just being a face of any old face, but there's evidence that this man who this is a carving of actually looked something like this. His name was Peter Parler, and he was one of the stonemasons working on this, someone in charge of designing an element of this. And there's evidence to suggest that this was not just a face applied to this figure, but that it was done from real life. So the idea that a portrait in stone becomes a likeness rather than just sort of a placeholder with a sign on it, indicating who it is that we're trying to think of in this instance. Realism creeping in this way as well.